Okay, so tonight we're gonna finish up, measurement issues. And really, there's only like, I just looked, there's like 4 or 5 slides. So, I did bring instructions for your evaluation plans. So we can go over those. And then if you guys have any questions, because we've got like 3 more, well, including tonight, like 3 more weeks that we meet, and then we're done. So, so we just make sure that we get all your questions asked and answered. Are there any questions about last time? Any issues? And I guess, I didn't think about this, but I will put the PowerPoint from last week and this week online, just because we had issues with the LCD projector last time. So, no questions before we get started? Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about external validity, and that's going to be just the last issue around measurement that we're going to talk about this semester. And so when we're talking about external validity, we're talking about being able to generalize your results to another population, okay? Which for most of you, since you're getting your master's, you're not going to do a lot of stuff related to external validity. On the other hand, at a doctoral level, you probably will. And if you're looking at evidence-based interventions, they've looked at this external validity piece. So, just to kind of talk about it. So again, like I said, it's can the findings be generalized to subjects or settings studied beyond subjects and settings studied in the experiment? So, like I said, with the evidence-based interventions, like this is the thought process that's going in, is looking at can we generalize to other populations. And so even in your capstone experiences, whether they're your graduate projects, your thesis, or your dissertation, you might be asked about, can you generalize to other populations? And most often you can't, but sometimes you might be able to. So, in other words, if we do the same thing again, the same intervention, the same work again with some other group, will it work again? Is another way of thinking about external validity. So sometimes it will, sometimes it won't, because you're changing the population, you might be changing the setting, even just slight differences, whether it's older, younger, differences in racial and ethnic groups, or even, like comparing, doing something here at UNLV and then trying to do the same thing at UNR or even Nevada State. Yes, they're both, in-state institutions and they're 4-year schools. However, their populations are very different. So you might get very different results just based on the different settings. So like with internal validity and reliability, there are going to be things that are going to be threats to external validity. So there are going to be things that are going to impact whether or not you can generalize to other populations. So one of them is going to be social desirability. So with social desirability, the person that you're asking the question to is going to respond in a way that they think you want them to respond. Okay? So, like, you see this sometimes when you're talking about drinking alcohol or using illicit drugs or even sex behaviors. People aren't going to always tell you the truth because they think, oh, well, they're doing an HIV thing. I need to tell them that I'm using a condom kind of thing. Or, it sounds really crazy that I drink a 6-pack of beer a night. But, in reality, that's what you do. But you might say, oh, well, I drink a 6-pack a week kind of thing. Kind of that social desirable kind of thing. In some of the work I've done, I always try to make sure that the people who are asking the questions kind of reflect that demographic, especially, when you're looking at, asking men about risk behaviors, trying to have a man ask the men about risk behaviors, and with females, having a female do it, because you can easily introduce that social desirability with, having mixed gender across things like that. So really kind of watching that. If you're doing like qualitative data collection, really kind of check your face and your facial management skills. Like, you don't want to be, like, it's when somebody's saying something, you don't want to be like this, because that kind of is encouraging of what they're doing. And, at the same time, you don't want to show shock and fear and all kinds of things, because then, somebody's like, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And then they might backtrack on what it was that they were saying. So really, if you're doing interviews or you're training people to do interviews, really teach them how to check their facial management skills. Because, when they fail, then people go, oh, damn, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Or, now that, like they seem like, oh, well, that's what they want to hear. And they, they go down a path that they really had no business going down. So another one is expectancy effect. So some of you all may have heard of this Rosenthal effect or Rosenthal theory, where people are going to behave how you expect them to behave. Okay? And so, like, you see this a lot of times, like, with kids. If you expect them to be little badass kids and they kind of know that's what you expect, then sometimes they tend to be little badass kids. Even though they're not necessarily little badass kids, they're just behaving the way you expect them. Or, vice versa. If you expect them to be really good, then, the chances are that they'll be really good. So, be aware of when you're going in and you're collecting data or you're working with people, like, kind of be neutral. Like, don't give away like what you expect or anything like that, and people may ask you, they'll say, well, what is it that you expect us to do, or what is it that we want you to do? Be very clear. We want you to be yourself. We want you to tell us what's going on. Don't feel like, you're going to say things one way or the other, And, sometimes I hear myself saying, I don't really care what it is that's, you do or what it is that you think. I just, just do whatever. Like don't try to do things to impress me. Do what you normally do so that you kind of minimize this expectancy effect. Another one is Hawthorne effect. So, and we talked a little bit about a related concept when we were talking about measurement validity, or not measurement validity, I'm sorry, internal validity in terms of people feeling special. Like they feel like, oh, I'm being observed, I'm being watched, I'm in this program, so I must be better, and so then they act very differently because of that. And so, on some level, that's why, people are going now to one group gets, the actual intervention, and then the other group who's not getting the actual intervention gets something else, so that you kind of minimize this Hawthorne effect of people feeling, special because of what's going on. But, you also want to make sure that you're not, you yourself as the evaluator, as the person who's collecting the data, you're not treating people any more special because they're in your project. Placebo effect. So placebo effect is, a lot like what it sounds. So people change their behavior because they believe in the effectiveness of the intervention or of the treatment. So people know that, hey, I'm getting this treatment. Oh, it's supposed to help me lose weight, So now, not only are they doing whatever your program is to help them lose weight, but they've got their Fitbit and they're walking all over the place and they're adding up all their steps and they're doing all these other things. So they're believing in the treatment, but they're also taking it a step further. And so you don't want people doing that. And really to try to minimize that, that's where you go through the blinding process, and people don't know what they're getting, if they're getting the actual treatment or if they're getting something else. So, like I said, controlling for threats to external validity is, we do what we call blinding. So, in the blinding process, that means somebody doesn't know who's getting what treatment, or who's getting the treatment and who's getting the getting nothing, or the other intervention. So you can blind participants so that they don't know. And that's when you have a single blind. You're saying participants don't know what's going on. You can do another thing called double blind. So you'll hear people talk about double blind study. So here's where the participants and the investigators don't know who's getting what treatment. So in here, when we're talking about investigators, we're really kind of talking about not necessarily the staff who's implementing, but the people who are overseeing the evaluation or overseeing the implementation of the intervention, they don't know who's getting what treatment and who's in which group. Okay? And then if you do triple blind, now you're doing participants, investigators, and evaluators. So even the people who are collecting the data don't know who's getting what treatment. Okay, so obviously randomization helps with external validity as well. So being able to randomly select people, being able to randomly assign people, help with the with external validity. But then if you can add the blinding piece so that people don't know what they're getting, okay? So, you know, one place to think about this is in your informed consent, because in your informed consent you have to say that this is a study on blah 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 blah. So you may want to think about in that, you know, giving enough detail but not too much that people know which group they could end up in. So maybe it's just, you know, you're saying you're doing a study about, I don't know, let's say you're looking at food choices, okay? And so we're doing an intervention around food choices. So rather than going into detail and saying some groups will get the, you know, it's possible you could be assigned to a group who gets the actual intervention and then another group who gets a different intervention. You just say that you're, you know, doing a study looking at food choices and that, you know, you'll be comparing results of two different groups kind of thing. So that you're not tipping it that, you know, one group is going to get the actual intervention and one group is going to get something related to, I don't know, like sleep, you know, improving their sleep kind of thing. So, you know, everybody's still getting an intervention, they're just not getting the same thing. And so you've really got to think through, like, how do you go about doing this? So even in working with your staff or with yourself, you want to make sure that when you're going to collect data or you're going to implement the intervention, that you're not tipping your hand that, oh, you're the group that's getting the intervention, you know, or there's another group who's not getting the intervention. You want to be very clear, you know, just treat both groups the same so everybody's okay with whatever it is that they're doing. And I think, yeah, that's the actual slide, last slide. I told you there was like 4 slides. I was like, oh, okay. But, I mean, and I think, you know, this kind of leads into talking about your evaluation papers, but even thinking bigger in terms of your capstone experiences, the issues around validity, reliability, whether it's internal validity, it's measurement validity, it's external validity, all have to be taken into account, okay? So if you want to be able to say that your project is a good project and it had an impact and it may cause whatever changes that you've seen, you have to take into account all of these issues around validity and reliability and things like that. And you've got to think through, okay, if this is what we want to do, then we've got to have either a control or a comparison group that we can look at. And we've got to figure out how are we going to figure out what those can be. Okay? So thinking through, like, where would we get another group of students similar, like if we were doing UNLV students, where would we get another group of students similar to UNLV? You know? And it's kind of hard because you're not necessarily you're not going to have a one-to-one match. You're not going to be very similar. But in terms of, doing your statistics and then calculating, you're going to want to compare the group that gets the intervention with the group that doesn't get the intervention to make sure that statistically they're not different. Okay, so you want to, for example, compare age, so you're going to want to do a t-test to see whether or not there are differences in age. Because if there are, then you've got a problem and you've got to, think through your issues around validity and reliability. On the other hand, sometimes you may not be able to come up with a control or comparison group. So for example, if, people, like let's say, people are applying to the MPH program here, okay? Well, we attract a certain population that's, say, different from what UNR would attract, okay? So is it fair then to compare our MPH population to the MPH population at UNR? Probably not. Our population is probably a little bit more diverse, and may have, some other things going on. We might have a slightly older population, and I'm just speculating on this, because we have, people who have either started their undergrad and then stopped and went to work and then came back and finished their undergrad and now are moving in to their master's program. So they, they have some work experience under their belt, and so they're a little bit older. We might also have students who got their undergraduate degree and then went off and worked and now are coming back and getting their master's degree. So we might have a slightly older population compared to UNR. So then you have to say, okay, well, if we can't necessarily compare our MPH students to UNR's MPH students, then you have to think, is there another group of students? Okay, and there might be, and if you're looking at issues around public health, you'd have to look at other public health programs to see if there might be a difference. But then the other part too is, you can't, so you're going to have students, so here's what happens when students apply. Students apply to the MPH program, okay? You have some who get accepted and some who don't, okay? Well, obviously, you can't compare the ones who got accepted to the ones who didn't. I mean, they're inherently different for a reason, okay? Then, you can't say, all right, so we've eliminated the ones who didn't get accepted as a potential comparison group. But then you can't say, we'll compare those that enrolled versus those that didn't. Okay? Because some, you might say, well, not everybody that got accepted comes. But there might be some inherent reason why people aren't coming. Okay? I mean, we are in Las Vegas. It's, maybe people, coming from the East Coast. So we might find that people coming from the East Coast are not enrolling. Okay, so we can't compare them to those who are enrolling because they're different from different geographical regions. So all of these are things that you have to kind of take into account and thinking about what it is that you're going to do. So with your program or with your evaluation plans, you all will have to think all of this through, okay? And think about, can you randomly assign people to an intervention group and a non-intervention group? Okay? And I want you to seriously think all of this through, like not just say, I can't think of a group, so I'm not doing it, like taking the easy way out. But seriously think about it and like whether or not you can actually come up with anything. So here are the instructions for your evaluation plans. Hopefully, you have your program plan electronically, okay? And if not, hopefully you can get it electronically. So what you're going to do is write an evaluation plan for your program plan that you wrote in 720. Okay, when I say an evaluation plan, and we'll talk about this, I think it's next week, we talk about planning evaluations. But when we talk about evaluation plans, we're talking about putting together a document that says, here's how we're going to evaluate this program. Okay, so in the past, people have said, well, do we have to come up with results, or do we have to actually have, evaluation data? Do we have to collect any data? No. You're just coming up with the plan for, here's how we're going to evaluate it. So if you had to take it and give it to somebody else, they could say, oh, okay, I see how you're going to evaluate this. I can go ahead and implement that for you. Okay? So your first thing that your evaluation plan should have is a description of your program. Okay? It does not, don't cut and paste, summarize. Okay? What it is that you're supposed to be doing. It's, what are the program and the type of activities that are occurring. So talk about, obviously you've got to talk about your objectives and describe your intervention and other activities that you have going on. Talk about your target audience and who the program will be implemented with. And I get it. Like, some of you now are going to look back at your program plan and go, what? What were we thinking? Or some of you are going to look back at your program plan and you're going to go, I told them that was stupid. I'm not doing that. And you're going to want to change it. You can make changes, okay? And if you make changes, say that here, okay? Because you're going to have to include in the appendix your original program plan, okay? And I have you include that because in the event you don't tell me something in your description, then it doesn't leave it to chance that I take points off, okay? So just include the original in your appendix, but if there are things that you're going to change, just say, well, instead of doing blah, 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 or instead of implementing this intervention, I decided to, I've changed it to do another intervention. Or, I changed the objectives because I realized they weren't as smart as they could be, or they're hard to measure. And then talk about, your new objectives. Don't restate the whole program plan in this description. Okay? Include a logic model outlining your program. So if you've already got, if you're okay with the logic model you've got, then that's fine. You can use that one. If you're making changes to your program, obviously you need to probably make changes to your logic model as well. Then you need to describe your stakeholders. So who are the people that have a vested interest in your program, in your project? Who has either, whether it's in the implementation or it is in the evaluation or has a vested interest with your community that you're working with? Tell me who has a vested interest. Think about, this is, if you read through all of this, you'll see that we're kind of reflecting the CDC model for program evaluation. So really describe who that might be. Here, try to make it as realistic as possible. So if you may not know names, but you may know organizations. But think about who realistically has a vested interest and is a stakeholder. And then outline the goal or the goals of the evaluation. So overall, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Okay? Now, think about this from the perspective of you know, is this a new area for you? So let's say, you know, some of you all may have jumped in groups and now you're doing something like Jake. Let's say Jake jumped into a group that's doing something related to teen pregnancy, okay? But we all know Jake is a dietitian, okay? So for him, it's going, you know, let's say for him and his organization, it might be now that they're going to need to really focus more on the process level stuff because they need to, you know, they're just learning how to do this. But on the other hand, like Brenda, with your, you know, like with you, you've been doing sexual health and teen pregnancy and HIV prevention, STI prevention. That's what your intervention is, and you feel comfortable. So you can think more long term about, you know, oh, we want to do not only just process level stuff, but we also want to do more extensive stuff. Okay? So think about the goals for your for your evaluation. Understand though that I am going to want you to do all levels of evaluation, okay? So even though, you know, like with the example with Jake, even though Jake is doing something new and they're going to be really focused on process level, Jake might want to say, you know, in a year, 2 years of implementation, now we're going to be moving into more other things, and so this is what we're going to be doing. Then you're going to describe your process monitoring and evaluation activities. So what are you going to do for those levels of evaluation? So talk about what is it that you're going to be measuring. Make sure, looking at your objectives, what does your objective say that you need to measure? How are you measuring it and why? Describe your data collection. In other words, what are your evaluation questions, your indicators, and your sources of evidence for your objectives? Talk to about who will be, who will collect the data and when. Okay? And so think about, so you can put, you know, like the tables that we did with, you know, the evaluation question, the objective, indicator, source of evidence. You can do that, but you need to explain it. Okay? Don't just drop it in there and say, oh, TRO, get it. Explain it, because if it went to somebody else, would they understand? Okay? And ultimately, you know, my goal is for, with you all, with your program plans and now your evaluation plan, if you know, connected with an organization and they wanted to do something, not necessarily that you want to wholesale give them your work, but, you know, you want to show an example of here's what we've done, and you want to have as much information, because if it's something that you haven't looked at, even in a few months, you know, you want to have enough information there that you can explain it to them without looking crazy. Then you're going to describe your outcome monitoring and your outcome evaluation activities. Okay? So you're going to need to look at what are you measuring here, how are you measuring it, and why. Describe your data collection as before, you know, so your evaluation questions, your indicators, your source of evidence. Talk about who will collect your data and when the data will be collected. But remember here, you're also going to talk about evaluation design. Okay? So you need to describe the evaluation design that you'll use, as well as use the notation, the evaluation notation, the X's and the O's and the R's, remember those? And draw out your design. Please make sure for your X's and your O's, you explain what those are. Okay? So remember, we talked about, you know, like observation 1, intervention 1, observation 2, observation 3, observation 4. So then you would say underneath, whoops, this should be O1 equals, and then O2 equals O3, O4, and explain what those are, and then X1 equals, so you need to make sure you include that legend when you're writing up your evaluation design piece. Okay? You have to address whether or not you can have a control or a comparison group. Okay? So I really want you to think this through and not just say, oh, I can't have a control or a comparison group because I can't think of anything. Because trust me, if I can sit down and think about it, then I expect you to be able to sit down and think about it. So if I come up with something, you should be able to come up with it too. And in the event that you cannot come up with a control or comparison group, so like I said, we're comparing MPH students, and kind of like who we might be comparing them to. I mean, we probably could compare to UNR. I'm trying to think. ASU doesn't have an MPH program. Maybe University of New Mexico has a MPH program. So we could try to come up with a comparison group, okay? Or control group. But there are situations, like I said, where you're not going to be able to come up with that. And so in those cases, then you really need to explain why it's not possible to have that control or comparison group. You then, yes ma'am?
Could it be like the control group, could it be like within the same city but different like regions?
It could.
Okay.
It could. So, I think we've talked about like high schools and stuff.
Yeah.
So you could compare different high schools across the city. I would just say make sure as much as possible there's as minimal contact between the high schools, okay, which sometimes is kind of tricky,
Yeah.
depending upon your population.
Yeah.
Okay, so like for example, if you're talking about athletes, there tends to be a lot of contact between the athletes, but just regular students, there's some, but not an awful lot. Like, especially not if you're talking about like, let's say El Dorado and Desert Oasis that are like opposite sides of town. There might be some contact, but there's not going to be a whole bunch of contact between regular students. So, I mean, yeah, that's a way, you could do it as well as thinking about those kinds of things. So all like the threats to validity that we've talked about, talk about which ones are going to be relevant for your situation. Okay? So in the event that you have a control or a comparison group, you're going to control for a lot more things than if you only have your one group. Okay? So, history should affect both groups the same, maturation should affect both groups the same. Those kinds of things should be, and you might even say, because you've got two groups, these threats are going to affect both groups the same, so they're, kind of void each other out. On the other hand, if you don't have a control or a comparison group because you can't come up with one, then now you've got to say, here are the things that potentially can affect our ability to say these results are good. Also think about biases towards valid and reliable measures. So we talked about, those measurement validities of the construct and content and all of those. Then what are the biases that are going to impact that? Talk about those. Even the threats to reliability. Talk about those. What could impact? I'm not asking you to come up with tools for data collection for this, although the thought has always crossed my mind to do that, but that would take way more work, and plus I don't want you just coming up with random stuff that doesn't work. So talk about all of that. Then So you're going to talk about all of that under outcome monitoring, outcome evaluation. I'm not going to have you focus on that long-term evaluation, that impact evaluation. So, like changes in health status and in some cases behavior, things like that. We're not going to focus on that. We're just, process level, outcome level, that short-term evaluation. So once you talk about all of that, then you're going to describe how you're going to disseminate your evaluation results. So how are you going to let people know that this is what you found? Okay. We will talk about some of this in a couple of weeks when we talk about dissemination, but you'll talk about who do you plan on sharing your results with? Obviously your stakeholders, but it might be general public, academics, etc. How are you going to do that? Is it going to be newsletters? Are you going to do conference presentations? Are you going to utilize social media? Because that's always a good way of getting information out, etc. You're going to come up with a budget and a budget justification for your evaluation costs. Okay, I'm not going to put a limit on how much your evaluation budget should be. Okay, and when I say that, people go, "Oh, well, that sounds." But the reality is, sometimes you can have limits on your evaluation costs of like 10% of your overall budget or 25% of your overall budget goes to evaluation. So, I'm not going to force you guys to think in those terms yet right now, because this is still kind of a learning environment. I think it's more important you learn to say how much it's going to cost for the evaluation, and then you can always back out things later. So, but you'll have to come up with a budget and a budget justification. One thing you don't have to come up with is a timeline, okay? Because some of this obviously will be ongoing data collection. It's not going to be, like, oh, we're just going to collect it at 6 months and at 3 months, but it's going to be an ongoing thing. One thing that I should say is that some of you all, probably quite a few of you all, when you wrote your program plans for your administrative and policy assessment, you may have only come up with like one objective. Okay? For this activity, go back and look at the logic models that have those multiple objectives. They have like 9 or 10 objectives, and fold those into your program, and then talk about evaluating all of those. Okay? So just adding, you will have to add those additional objectives. Any questions about any of that so far? Kind of sort of makes sense.
How long are these typically? Like, I know it probably varies.
I would say, obviously with your program plan, it makes them a lot longer. But the evaluation plan piece could be anywhere from like 10 to 20 pages, 25 pages max, I think is about what I've seen. So, in terms of tips, okay, your evaluation plan should relate to all of the objectives in your program plan. Okay, so if you start telling me you're going to evaluate these things, I'm probably going to look in your original program plan or in your description to see, does this match what you originally said you were going to do, or what you revised it and now said that you were going to do. So don't leave out objectives. Okay, so if you're doing process level objectives, address all process level objectives, or outcome objectives, make sure you address all of those. Don't kind of leave it up to chance for, oh, well, see, I did an example of one, so this is what we're going to do. Do it for all of your objectives. Think outside the box. in terms of coming up with your evaluation. What is it? How like you talk about how are you going to meet your objective? Okay. Think a little bit outside the box. Like don't just be like a survey or whatever. Sometimes, and that's not to say that a survey isn't always going to be appropriate, but there are other ways of knowing whether or not people change their behavior or they've had an increase in knowledge than just doing a survey. And so I want you, since it's a safe environment, think about other ways of doing things. Like always assume that whoever's reading your plan is not familiar with evaluation and so on and so forth. So define and explain everything. Oh yeah, because this is doing web campus, please. And I think now I have it in as a turn it in assignment, so you have to upload a document. But I think there's still a box where you can copy and paste stuff in there. Please don't copy and paste your document into that text box that they give. I mean, because it'll all go in there, but it'll lose the formatting and it just makes it awful and horrible to read. I will say, some of you all I know work together on your evaluation plans. On your program plans. This is not a group project, so number one, you should be like, yeah, I can do this by myself, yay! Don't have to worry about meeting with anybody, yay! Okay, but then the other part of it too is that don't be concerned that you're going to come up with the exact same thing. Okay, and I think you guys have seen that through the group activities that we've done this semester. You guys get the same thing, you look at different groups are looking at the same thing and still come up with something different. So, having said that, you can talk to each other, but don't come up with the same thing. So, everybody kind of look at things a little bit differently. If you have issues uploading your document, one, it might be due to size. So you may have to upload the evaluation plan, but say email me your program plan. If you run into those issues, contact the help desk if you have any challenges. Push come to shove, you can always email the file to me, but I still would like something uploaded into Web Campus, okay, because that becomes my repository for that. In terms of format, like everything else, use APA style, use paragraphs and subtitles to kind of organize your text, double space your paper with 1-inch margins. Don't use funky fonts, they're going to be hard to read, and regardless of what font style you use a 12-point font. It's going to be okay to use tables, graphs, charts, although I don't know, charts and graphs you probably won't use for this, but you probably will use tables. Just make sure you explain the table, okay? And again, because this is going up into Web Campus, so I'm going to be responsible for printing them. Make sure that you number your pages so I don't get pages out of whack and stuff. So does that make sense? Any questions, concerns about this? Seems pretty straightforward. So, okay.
We still have our test the following Thursday, right? Or is that the last day of our class too? That they have to do that?
Wait a minute, let me think. I don't have my, wait a minute, I might have my syllabus here. So, how this is working. So tonight we finished up measurement issues and evaluation. So next week we'll talk about planning evaluations. Then the week after that we'll talk about disseminating your evaluation results. Then the week of April 24th is when you're supposed to have your exam. That'll again be on web campus, so we won't be meeting. So basically our last meeting is 2 weeks from tonight. Okay, so that's why, I keep saying get your questions asked and answered, because we're only gonna be seeing each other for 2 weeks. And then you have the week of May 1st to work on your evaluation plans. And then your evaluation plans are due on May 8th. And they're due by 8 p.m. because that's when, if we were having an exam, that's when the exam time would be over. Okay? If you have questions or concerns, you can always email me and say, hey, is this right? Or if you need to come by office hours. I would say right now, because it's the end of the semester, things get kind of crazy, so my office hours get subsumed with other things. So just email me or text me and say, hey, I want to come by and see you. When's a good time? Okay, because like today I canceled office hours. I may not have office hours this Thursday. I know actually in 2 weeks I won't have office hours either. So, just, reach out to me and we can figure out a time to meet, even if it's by phone or something like that. So, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Doctoral, extra assignment?
Yes, I was going to talk to you about that
Okay.
after everybody else, since you're the only one now for evaluation. So, yes. Any other questions, comments? Okay then. I don't have anything else. So Prescott laughs because he's like, yes, we need to go.
Look at my defense.